Ishmael Bey is here, a man who is here to tell a story about hope and redemption. He was a child soldier during the Civil War in Sierra Leone in the 90s. Through his own initiative, through luck, through the help of others, he found his way to the United States, graduated Oberlin, and became an author. Many of you have read A Long Way Gone. In 2007, Time magazine named it the third most important book of the year, nonfiction. And by the way, in January, he has a new book out, a novel called Radiance of Tomorrow. I also found out that in February, he's going to be a dad. Nice. For those of you who are seniors, you remember that you oohed nod when he told you about his girlfriend. Well, they're married, and he's going to have a child. He works for the UN, UNICEF, working on some of the issues that he faced as a young man. And I think many of you know him also as a warm, open man, young man, a soccer player. And it's just a pleasure to have him here. And I should note that he would not be here today, and he would not be here 5 years ago. He would not have been here 5 years ago without the help of Richard Marks, our alumnus class of '68. Where's Richard? There, right there. Remember, good things don't just happen. There are good people that make them happen. Anyway, Richard's one of them. I give you Ishmael Bey.
Good evening. Okay, can everybody hear me very well? Yeah. Good evening to everybody. It has been wonderful being here throughout the day, observing people going about their daily activities. I had the opportunity to play, thanks to the coach for letting me jump in. I began to realize that I'm no longer a young man because some of these young boys were quite fast. But anyway, what I want to do is this. I want to speak a little bit about why I decided to write my first book, the memoir, A Long Way Gone, the reasons that led to it. And through that, I'm going to perhaps describe to you some of the parts that were not in the book. But those were the beginnings of the thought that I wanted to say something about what had happened to me and what continues to happen to so many other young people around the world, even as I speak to you. The issue of child soldiers or children associated with armed groups, it's not an African issue, it's a global problem. It's all over the world. In the capacity of my work as a UNICEF ambassador for children in armed conflict, I travel around the world, from Colombia to Sri Lanka to Congo, of recent Central African Republic, to engage warlords and governments to remove children from their ranks. Now, as most people, when you say child soldier, the image that comes to mind is the boy with the AK-47, and possibly in Africa, and also rebel groups. But actually, government armies also recruit children. In addition, child soldiers are not only boys, they're also girls who fight, who go through the same sort of madness, and in addition, they're sexually abused, and some of them even have children during the course of the war. So the problem is enormous, and it's difficult. Over the years, it has been also quite difficult to convince, if you can believe it, international community to do something about it, to provide, to protect children from being dragged into the violence. Most countries will sign a paper that says they agree, but when it comes to implementation, they would not do anything. So it's pretty much like convincing parents to take care of their children, and they would refuse to do it, to protect them from violence. So it's quite frustrating, but we continue to do the work. But let me tell you a story, and then we get to some of the technical parts later. As you heard, I'm from Sierra Leone, which is a very small country in West Africa. I'm going to point it out here if I can find it, this one. So I'm from this country. It's a very small country. Prior to the 1990s, when we had a civil war, most people did not even know about us, that we existed. We're a very quiet nation. It was a very beautiful country, still is. And we had a very simple lifestyle where there was a strong sort of idea of friendship, where as a boy I would walk from my village 6-7 miles to my grandmother's village. I would not fear anything on the path. I would encounter all sorts of people, say hello to them. And I also, Sierra Leone is a former British colony, so we had English languages are sort of the language that we learn when we go to school, even though we have 15 languages and 3 dialects. And I grew up in this context. Also, as a boy growing up, we had an oral tradition storytelling that was part of my upbringing. So in the evening, everybody would sit around the fire and the older people would tell stories to the young. This was how we learned how to function in our traditions, how we learned the moral and ethical standards that were required of us and what we needed to do. But this storytelling also a way that trained us to listen deeply, because in my culture also, the idea of listening and internalizing information is very important, because we're an oral tradition culture. So stories are passed on to the young through that. And how they tested if young people listen was that at any of these gatherings, a young person would be randomly called upon to retell a story that had been told. Now, if you couldn't remember the story, you became known as the child who doesn't listen. Everybody, for the rest of your life, that's how you'll be known. So you listen deeply, and then when you're called upon, you were ready to retell the story. They also had techniques that I later used in my writing as a writer, which is that whenever they wanted to tell a new story, they would retell an older story, and through that telling, they would change facts and structure just to see if people were listening. If nobody protested in the audience, they knew no one was listening. But if people said, no, that's not how the story is, then they knew people were listening, and then they would tell the new story. Because the idea is that you won't tell people new stories if they're not ready to receive it. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. In addition to this oral tradition storytelling, my father worked for an American mining company that was in this remote part of the country that I grew up in. That was mining a mineral called rutile, and bauxite and iron ore and various other things. So because my father worked for them, I would go to the mining quarters where they had televisions mounted in the public area. Now I grew up, I didn't have electricity, tap water, none of these things. So I would go to these places. I remember the first time we went there, we tried to swim in the swimming pool. I did not particularly like it, because when I came out, my skin was very, very pale because of the chlorine, it reacted. And I also could not understand that why anybody would want to swim in a stagnant body of water, because I had grown up swimming in the river, so I didn't really understand why people were doing that. But this was where I was also introduced to American popular culture. This was American hip-hop music, because it was on the television. And this was in the day of what you call Yo MTV Rap. Some of you don't know what that is. You're quite young. And so this is how I discovered American hip-hop music. So I had a British model of education, the oral tradition storytelling, and then American hip-hop. So I used to do the Running Man and all of these things. My father did not like any of this, because he felt the American English was spoiling our proper British English, and so he was against it. But nonetheless, we love this form. In addition to this, I played football. Of course, where I come from, football or soccer is what everybody plays every evening, during lunch, during break, every time you get the free time to yourself, you play. And we play barefoot, so we don't have any boots. And it's quite nice, actually. Anyway, this was the reason why I'm telling you all of these things, just to give you a background of what my life was. I was the second born in a family of 3, all boys. As when I was very young, my parents separated. I have very little memory of it, of having that family life together. So my older brother and I grew up with our father. And so I grew up in that context where as boys, you really talk about anything that happened. If something happened, you just got over it and things like that. Because my father was also busy just trying to raise 2 boys. So all of this beauty and simplicity that was in my life and just began to change when a war started in the neighboring country, which is Liberia. When their war started, we started to see refugees coming from Liberia into Sierra Leone, and they would tell us about what had happened to them. How their towns have been destroyed, their children have been forced into the violence, and people who were once their neighbors no longer trusted them, how they've been walking for months without stopping, how they fear for their life. Now, we did not believe them. Sometimes we even felt some of the stories they told, they were exaggerating some of the things that they were talking about. And then the war started in the eastern part of the country, near the Liberian border as well. And we still did not believe when people from our own country were coming and they were telling us about what had happened to them. We did not believe it because the kind of environment that I grew up in, it was difficult to believe that this was possible. And they told us stories as how their children had been forced at gunpoint to kill members of their own family because this was the methodology that the rebel group at first, and later the army, when they recruited children, they would force them, put weapons in their hands and force them to kill their own parents or their grandparents and bring destruction upon their own community. Now this was very deliberate because when this happened, that young person would no longer be able to return to their community. Therefore, you belong to these groups and they can use you whichever way they wanted. And so this was a deliberate way to destroy the structures that had existed in the community. Now, when the war came to my part of the country, I was 12 years old and I started running from it. Prior to that, I did not really know anything. I'd seen war films such as Rambo and things like that, but I did not really know what war meant. Now, when I started running from the war, my first introduction, I will never forget, was that but my older brother and I and some friends who were doing this in this dance group had gone to another town for a talent show when the war reached my town. And we tried to go back to find our families. And on that journey back, we began to see people running from the war. So we were going against the tide of people. And we saw two things that day that made me realize that this country that I once knew as a boy was no longer that country. And these were the two things. One was a man who had been carrying her son, who had been shot dead. And he was a little boy. And he carried him in his arms. And he was just running, trying to look for a hospital. But the boy was actually dead, but he refused to believe that. And nobody wanted to tell him because this kept him running. So nobody wanted to tell him the truth so that he may stop and give up. And I remember he was crying because, you know, and this was the first time I saw an older man crying pretty much like a baby, really, you know. I had lost all sorts of hope. And then the second one, which was even more devastating, was a woman who had been running from the war. Back home, women would tie their children on their back with a cloth. So she had tied her baby and she had been running from the war. And when she stopped at where we stood, she removed her child, only to realize that the bullet had struck the baby. And the only reason why she didn't reach her is because she had this baby on her back. And it was just a little baby girl. And when she removed that child, the pain on this woman's face was so severe she could not even cry. And this is when I began to realize if that could happen, then a 12-year-old could not be spared at all. And shortly after that, as we began to run, we realized we couldn't go back home. Another thing we caught, which is that, as I mentioned earlier, children had been used in this war. So because of that, the very innocence of what it meant to be a child had been destroyed. So when you came, imagine you're 9 years old, 10, 11, 12, under 18, you came to a town, either by yourself or with a group of other people, all the adults will run away from you. Because nobody trusted the innocence of young people anymore. Because sometimes it could be spies, and then afterwards they will raid their group and they will kill everybody in the town or in the villages. So because of that, it was very difficult as a young person to convince people that you were innocent and that you were running from the war as well. They expected violence. If you can imagine that, any of you, your age, you come to a town and everybody would just run away. And no one was there to explain to us what was really happening. Why was this going on? In some places where people couldn't run away, they would try to kill you to protect their families. So you constantly, not only were people trying to recruit you, also people were afraid of you. So it became very, very difficult to be a young person. I was running from this war for about a year, constantly. Near-death experiences. Some of the kids that I was running with died along the way. Either people were struck by stray bullets, or some of them just because they ate something. And then we also learned how to harden ourselves. So when somebody died, you learn not to feel too much pain because it will paralyze you from running, from going forward. So we learned to just abandon people and continue running. Between those years, between 12 and 13, I lost my entire family in the war. They were killed. And the only reason that I was spared is because I had arrived late. If I had been there a few minutes earlier, I would have been killed alongside them. But I was so heartbroken and devastated that I wished I was there. At least I would have had a chance to see them one last time. Everybody was gunned down in the village. Some people were locked in the buildings and burned alive, and things of this sort happened. And there were also other family members of some of the kids that I was running with. So my mother, my father, and 2 brothers were killed in the war, and I survived only because I'd been separated from them. When the war reached your town, what usually happens is this. Maybe you go to the field to play football, or you go to the river to fetch water, and you hear gunshots, and you begin to run from wherever you are. If you're lucky, the only thing that you come out with is your life. If you're extremely lucky. So the violence that has started occurring in this country was so high, and each time one group did something to the other group retaliated with more violence. So the level of violence just escalated day after day, to the point that they even started amputating people. The idea was that they didn't want people to vote for the wrong people, so they would amputate people. So when they would capture you, they would ask you whether you wanted long sleeve or short sleeve. Long sleeve meant they would cut your hand here, and short sleeve meant they would cut it up here. So these are some of the things that they would do. And so you saw this all the time. With no anesthesia, and they would just leave you to bleed. Some people would die by bleeding, and some people survived some of these things miraculously. So this was my life. I was running now, and then along with a few other kids, we went to a military base, thinking it would be the safest place to go, and this is where we were recruited and trained. In the midst of war, less than a week, we learned how to shoot, and all the basic commands, and perfection came actually going to war to fight, to shoot. And our lives changed from people who were running from war to now actually bringing the violence to people. Now there was coercion. If you didn't do what you were told, you'd be killed or you'd be severely beaten. In addition to that, there was also drugs that were being forced upon us, so we became addicted to them, and it became a way to cope with the violence. Now the group became the new family, because we had lost everything. Most of the boys and the girls in the group were orphans. This was our new community. But to belong to this new community required violence. The more violence you committed, the more it showed your loyalty to this group. And because we had nothing else, this became our father figures, the commanders, this was our group. And when I was there, I believed everything. One of the ideology was that the other group was responsible for what had happened to you, the death of your family, and the fact that you're no longer a child. You're caught up in this violence, even though you're a child, but you cannot have your childhood. So we have to make sure this doesn't continue to happen to other people. And so we wanted revenge, and we also wanted to make sure it didn't happen to other people. This is what we were told. Now later on, after the war, we realized that this is what was told to everybody who joined any other group. Everybody else was told that the other group was responsible for but everybody was culpable for all of the things. So I was in this war for nearly 3 years. War became my life. It's all I knew how to do. I even became a junior lieutenant in my group. I got shot a number of times. I was died many times. And luckily for me, the United Nations had gone into Sierra Leone, as they do in many other countries, and they started negotiating with some of the warlords to remove some of the kids from the fighting. I was fortunate enough to be removed from the war. I was very upset. I didn't want to leave because I didn't know where else I was going. And I was brought to the capital city of my country, where I began rehabilitation to learn how to function again as a normal kid. Now in the capital city, the war had not reached the capital city, Freetown. And Freetown is along, actually it's along the coast there. So it's in the western area, so it's along the coast there. And the Atlantic Ocean. And so I was brought there, and it's the first time I'd been to the capital city of my own country, and I started learning how to function as a normal kid. It took me 8 months just to even learn how to sleep. I'd even forgotten, because when you're in the war, I was so drugged up, I developed insomnia. It was only violence that I knew how to solve my problems. And while I was there, before my rehabilitation time was over, they found my uncle. They would do family tracing, and I went to live with him after I finished, and still continue psychosocial therapy and these things. While I was living with my uncle, an opportunity came to send 2 young people to New York to speak about what had happened in Sierra Leone. And this was following a study that a woman called Graça Machel had done about the impact of armed conflict on children around the world. She had gone everywhere, not just in places where there were civil wars, but places like the favelas in Brazil, neighborhoods in Jamaica, everywhere around the world. Because our study was really looking at why do young people choose violence as an option, and what can governments do around the world to give them other options so that they're not left with only violence. And so she had gone and interviewed people around the world, including myself in Sierra Leone. So I was brought to New York for the launch of that report that actually later led to the creation of so many other laws that now are in place to protect the use of children in war. But what you realize is that when you leave from war, as I mentioned, you don't take anything with you, you just run. So I had nothing, and so I had to, passport is a luxury item in most countries. Even though it's a right, you don't have the money to get it, and you don't even know where to go to get it. So the United Nations got me a passport, and I was on my way to New York. Shortly after I'd come out of the war, I didn't know what that really meant. Actually, when I went for the interview, to qualify who would come, I told everybody off during the interview and left, and then I was selected to come to New York. And the reason why I told everybody off was because when I went to the interview, most of the candidates who were there were the sons and daughters of the ministers whose political corruption had created the war. And they were in line to come and talk about what was unfolding in Sierra Leone without even having experienced it. So I told everybody off and slammed the door, pushed some tables aside and left, and then I was selected. So sometimes it helps to speak your mind, I guess. So and I didn't know, before I told you I read Shakespeare, and I knew the word winter, but I had no physical relationship to it whatsoever. So we were coming to New York, nobody knew. So myself and this other young fellow who now lives in Canada got on the plane, and they bought us suitcases. I guess because they thought everybody was traveling had one. I had nothing in mind. It was an empty suitcase. I walked to the airport with it, I gave it to people who checked it in. I arrived, we got on the plane. First of all, we got on the plane and I thought, oh man, we've survived this war in Sierra Leone, we're going to die on this plane. Because the thing was so cold. And nobody told us you could turn the heat off, the cold air off. And so we're just shivering there. I'm thinking to myself, I was even coming up with plans. How do I jump out of this thing? Before it leaves the African, airspace. At least I know I'll be warm wherever I end up falling, And then it was also the first time in my life that I saw salad. I'd never heard of such a meal. If you go to Sierra Leone, you won't know what we eat, so you have to learn about the cuisine. Nobody told us. So all of a sudden, they started serving this thing that my friend and I looked at and said, we had no idea that people ate grass. Because, they pass these things around, and we were thinking to ourselves, man, so because of our experience from the war, we just waited. People ate 5-7 minutes, nobody had died yet. We thought, all right, it is good to eat. We tried it, we absolutely detested it. And then we arrived in Amsterdam to switch planes to come to New York. And it was the first time we saw so many white people, I grew up in my village. We've seen white people, very few though, who worked in the Peace Corps or who worked for the American Mining Company, but they were all men. We had never seen anybody else who was white who wasn't a man. So all of a sudden we landed in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and it was overwhelming. So many white people, so many of them. And so my friend and I were saying to ourselves, my friend and I, we looked at each other and we said, we had no idea they had them in women's versions, children's versions, and all of these things, we thought to ourselves, this is incredible, we thought they were only in men's versions, Anyway, we came and we got on the plane and we arrived in New York. It was winter of 1996. It was absolutely cold. I felt my face was going to fall off and there were these things falling out of the sky. I wanted to go back home. I could not comprehend how it was possible that people could function in this sort of weather. Where I come from, if it drops below 60 degrees, this is our winter. Get firewood and we sit around the fire, so you can imagine. And we didn't know it was winter, so we had no winter clothes. We only had like t-shirts and very flimsy pants. So I feel like, this is just getting worse and worse. I was not interested, I wanted to go back home. We were taken to Midtown Manhattan. We all had hotel rooms. It was the first time in my life that I had a room to myself. All my life I never had one, and they had television, shower, tap water. This was really incredible to me. To some of you, you may not know, you take it for granted, but for me, the fact that you could open this red thing and then hot water will come out of it was absolutely incredible. Because where I come from, if you wanted to, in my village, you wanted to bathe with hot water, first of all, you went to fetch the water. And when you came, you went to fetch firewood and you made fire and then you boiled the water. So to make hot water was a process. So I could not understand. I thought this was incredible. Just open it. So, when I went back, after this conference, I went back to Sierra Leone and I would explain these things to my uncle. And we would think about how this was possible. My uncle came up with an explanation that there was a guy somewhere with firewood and boiling drums and drums of hot water and would just pour it down when you were ready. This is the only way that this was possible. We had no, so anyway, these things were quite incredible to me. But there was something very strange in this room. The room was absolutely incredibly hot because the radiator was on. Again, I don't know what it is. I never had electricity. You have no use for such a thing in Sierra Leone. But the room was so hot that throughout the night I was sweating profusely. So I took off all my clothes and I'm thinking to myself, this is the most uncomfortable country in the world. You're so cold outside and you're hot inside, I mean, where's the in-between? So so in my very practical mind, where I'm coming from, I took my bedding because I had noticed earlier, because also when you come from the war, you notice a lot of things. Noticed earlier that in the hallway, it was nicely cool because the AC was there. So I came out there with my blankets and I lay by my door and I made it nice with the pillow and I started sleeping, And of course the hotel staff immediately came and said, you cannot sleep. I said, no, it's fine, it's really okay. It's really hot. From where I was coming from, this was fine to sleep there. I slept in worse places, And so they took me in and explained to me, and then I knew that these things were called the radiator. That's where the hot air would come from. So wherever I went, after that to the conference rooms, I would just look for one and I would sit next to it because I had no clothes. This is how my mom met me, the woman who later adopted me, Laura Sims. She was one of the facilitators for this conference. So she saw me and my friend, and she went and bought us jackets, hats, and gloves and these things, and they were able to venture out and discover New York a little bit. After this conference, I went back. I met so many young people from all over the world, and I went back to Sierra Leone. The war reached the capital city, but I was in touch with this woman, and there was a possibility of me being re-recruited again because they were going after all the kids who had fought to re-recruit them. And because I had this passport, I was able to leave the country. It wasn't easy, but at least I was able to go quicker than some people. Now, on that journey is when perhaps the idea that later became the book came about, which I never intended to publish, by the way, this book that I wrote. When I was on my way back, trying to find a way back to the US, where I have this woman who was ready to adopt me and put me in school, it was very difficult to go into any country or to get a visa to come to the US. Every time I showed up at the US Embassy, they would ask me to provide two documentation. One was a document that showed ownership of property, and two, a bank statement that showed that I had money, and these things would prove that I intended to return to my home country. And I remember looking at the guy behind the glass at the American Embassy and saying, there's a war in Sierra Leone, right? And he said, yes, I know, do you have those documents? And I remember thinking to myself, this guy has no idea what war really is and what it does to people. Let's assume that I had a bank statement or I had a document that showed that my grandfather owned this land or that land. Do you really think during a gunshot, when people are gunned down in front of you, you're thinking, I should really take my bank statement, or I should really take the document to my house? None of these things. People leave things behind that they've walked for years and just run, just to save your life. Families are separated. Older people who are handicapped cannot move. People are trampled upon. It's chaos. So I tried to explain to this fellow. He did not understand what I was trying to explain to him. And so I began to think that, there's a way people need to be educated. People need to know what these things are. When I arrived in the United States, eventually, a similar question came up. When I would go, my mother would take me around for schools. Everybody would ask me, do you have a report card? I was thinking to myself, what is wrong with these people, I mean, it's not like I thought I would survive the war, at least to keep my report card in my back pocket, So I said to them, no, I don't. And I remember a few people say, well, everybody has a report card. And I remember thinking to myself, no, a lot of people don't have a report card because you leave everything behind when you run from war. So actually how I got into high school, I wrote an essay about why I did not have a report card. This was my first essay in the United States. And I realized for me, writing had become a way to bring to life some of the things I could not provide physically, because I did not have them. Paraphernalia such as a baby picture, simple things, family pictures, I had lost everything. So everything I had was my memories of what my life had been prior to when some people would meet me. For example, in high school, everybody was asked to bring their baby picture for the yearbook. I was the only person who could not provide one. My friends the only conclusion they could jump to was that maybe I was a really ugly baby and I refused to produce my baby picture. And I found it really funny and I just laughed. So I had to write a poem about what I may have looked like as a baby. You know, so this is how writing came. But then I started thinking to myself, I need to find a way to explain to people. But at this point, I did not want anybody to know about my background. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I wanted to build newer memories. But also I felt when people heard about who I was without the context, they would begin to jump to all sorts of bad conclusions about me. And it happened when I was in school, because when I got into this school, the United Nations International School, the Parents Teachers Association had a meeting, and everybody was told that there's this kid who was a former child soldier. And so all the parents got afraid, thinking that, oh, he's a former child soldier in our school, he's going to lose it and kill everybody. This is what they thought, right? And I'm probably the last person who wanted anything to do with any form of violence, because I knew what it was. I lived it. I knew there was nothing romantic about it. I wasn't trying to prove. So the entire time I was in school, I was the only kid who never got into any fight with anybody, because I always laughed whenever somebody wanted to be tough with me. I just laughed. Some kids would come up to me, yeah, I'm tough, I'm from the Bronx. I used to laugh. Good for you, man, you know. It's good. You know, so people were always saying all these sorts of things, trying to be tough and trying to fight me, and I would just laugh, you know, because I knew if I even play fight with people, it will be interpreted differently because of my background. So I was very careful in the way I conducted myself. Now, I wanted to talk to people, and also, you know, it wasn't like if I made friends, I was just going to say to them during lunch, hey, by the way, you know, I used to be a child soldier. Yeah, let's go back to class now. That would be So I also felt I needed ample time to describe the context. And the other thing was this also. While I was in the United States, while I was thinking these things, people need to know where I'm coming from, I realized something also. The Sierra Leone wasn't in the news, but it started appearing in the news. And when it did, most people's introduction to this country came. So Sierra Leone equals amputation, madness, war, and not the Sierra Leone that I knew before the war or after the war. So the focus was only the violence. The media just put that, as if one morning we all just woke up and decided we were just going to fight each other. And lastly, people talked about us, former child soldiers. Some people had done the research and they called us the lost generation, which meant that because we had been through this violence, we would no longer be able to function, we were done. We were just time bombs waiting to explode. And here I was living in New York, walking past probably those same people, and in their wildest imagination, they would not guess what my background had been. If I had never written this book, you run across me anywhere in the United States, you would not know. You just think I'm just some other young fellow. You would not. So for me, I also started thinking, how do I show people that the human spirit is strong enough to recover from some of these things as well? And particularly that young people are resilient enough to come out of these things. So I started thinking that I would write something, write all the story down, so that I would prepare myself when I had a chance to argue with people or to give people context, I'll be able to do it succinctly and very well. That's why I started writing. I never intended to publish it. And I also thought, well, when I was working on it, that, you know, maybe when I have children, I would just give it to them. If they ever want to know about their father, I would just, yeah, it is. Knock yourself out. My mother got really worried about that when I made that joke. And so there were all these sorts of things. So later on, when I finished writing, by the time I graduated, I had written the book. And then some people that I knew convinced me to show it to some publishers. And I did, and they decided they really loved it, they wanted to publish it. I didn't know what any of this meant until I signed a contract to publish it, and I realized that, oh, everybody's going to know now. I was like, no way. And I wanted to take the contract back and say, no, absolutely not. And I'm glad in retrospect that I didn't do it. But it was very, very, you know, I didn't know what that meant. So when the book was about to be published, an excerpt of the book was printed in the New York Times magazine. And one Sunday, I was on the subway, living in Brooklyn, just a young man, and I got on the train, and everybody opened the Sunday magazine, and my face was on the cover. And when this photographer had taken the picture of me, he had said to me, you better get a hat and sunglasses, because when this comes out, you're not going to be able to hide anywhere. And I thought, oh, what is he saying? And I got off the next stop, and went and got a sunglasses. So I thought to myself, you know, this is not what I expected. And so I had to call a lot of people who were good friends with me and explain to them that, you know, when you've always thought I was a very unusual kid, you know, it was something that couldn't quite figure out, but well, guess what? It's coming out in a book. lots of it. So, just so you know, so I had to call a lot of friends to tell them some of these things. So, this is really, so the book came out of frustration, really, the writing of it. To jump a little bit, just to close and open it up to questions, is that so after this book came out, it gained a life of its own. I didn't think people would like it because of the nature of it, but it had a life of its own. And I also started working with the United Nations. I did that even before the book came out, where in the capacity as an ambassador for children affected by armed conflict, we do policy work to engage various nations around the world to be part of the discussion. Because even though in some places where civil wars occur, children are recruited, everybody's culpable to some extent. Because when I was in the war, we had weapons from everywhere. Most people usually say, oh, it's China, or it's Russia, from the Cold War, but there are weapons from everywhere. We had M16s from the United States. We had G3s from Germany. We had Israeli Uzis. Everybody was willing to sell weapons and get the diamonds and the natural resources in exchange. So everybody's going. So we try to talk to nations to find a way to settle this so that it doesn't work, children are not recruited. So, for example, last year we tried to pass an arms trade treaty, which many countries were against, and one of the top countries that was against this was the United States. They didn't want to have an arms trade treaty. It wasn't saying that people can own weapons. It was saying that let's control the flow of weapons in places where people can use it to kill others indiscriminately, and they were against it. I even had a fellow from the United States government telling me, well, okay, we can agree to amend some of the things in this document to say that we cannot control bullets. We can control the guns, but not the bullets. And I looked at this fellow and I said, have you ever had a weapon in your hand? And the answer was no, but he was the guy there because the weapon is only as good as the bullets. If you have an AK-47 with no magazine, no bullets, it's just a big stick, literally. But when you put in the bullets, then it becomes very dangerous. So to say that we can give you, and some of these weapons are already there, so people just want the bullets. So it was a very, anyway, so we faced these things. In addition to this, I go on the ground as well, to the same place that I was, to the countries that have a war going on, and try to negotiate the release of young people from the fighting forces. So we go into places where there are people carrying weapons, children, and we engage the commanders and try it. Now it's difficult for me because it brings up a lot of things from my own past, but you know, it's the least I can do for the fact that I survived this experience. And oftentimes it helps when I'm there, because some of the young people, when they're being removed, I can tell them, I used to be in this and I know how you feel exactly, and they help ease the tension a little bit. It's dangerous work, but somebody has to do it. Anyway, and as you heard, my second book is coming out, which is very different. It's about post-war, and it's actually fiction. So it looks at why people go back home, and things of that nature. Yeah, it's January 7th. And before I finished, I know that all of you are on social media, so you can follow me at Ishmael Bear. I was told to say this by my team, so excuse me for that. So when you leave here, you turn your phones on, you can follow me. And this will also because if you want to know some of the things that I engage in and I do when I go to this place, I usually tweet about the places that I am and the work that I'm doing so that the people can know what's going on in some of these places. So please do follow me. With that said, I'm going to end the talk here and open it up to questions. Now, please do not shy away from asking me any question that you want to ask me. If I don't want to answer your question, I will simply tell you I'm not going to answer it. But any question that you ask me, I will do my very, very best to answer as honestly as possible. So please raise your hand and I'll call upon you. Thank you again for your attention thus far. Yes. Yeah, and I'll rephrase the question for you.
So how did you begin your process of recovering from being a child soldier?
The question is, how did I begin my process of recovering from being a child soldier? When I was removed from the war, I was taken to a rehabilitation center in the capital, outside of the capital city, in the outskirts. And at this center, we went through psychosocial therapy and various things, but when we first got there, we were so violent, we beat up the staff members, Sierra Leoneans. stab them, and some of them would go, they won't come back, but most of them returned. So it was there that I began that process. But you know, one of the most difficult things actually was not being in the war. Because after a while, being in the war became normal. I normalized it. I knew how to function with the violence. I knew how to survive. But then all of a sudden, you're removed from it, and you're left with the memories of it. You don't have access to the drugs. So you're left with, you're haunted by everything. Nightmares come, flashbacks. You can't sleep because you have nightmares, so it becomes very difficult. So my mind actually became the thing that tormented me the most. So it was those 8 months that I spent there were very difficult. I had to withdraw from the drugs. I had to learn to start trusting people, which I didn't really do very well. It took many, many years, but it's a process. It wasn't just those 8 months at the center. It's many, many years later. Even to this day, I have certain tendencies from the war that I will never be able to get rid of. Some of them are positive. Some of them is just, they're just what they are. I can't. You know, for example, my awareness. Everywhere I go, I scan the place to know how I can leave if something happens. I'm not walking around expecting violence, but it's just part of who I am. You know what I mean? So I just think that way, you know. And it can be a good thing because I'm a writer, so my awareness is sharper, so I can observe details. So I can look at it positively as well. No. Yes. Yes.
In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the conflict over coltan is there. And what do you think, you know, from your work with the UN, what do you think developed countries who demand the products that come from that region need to do to prevent the conflict of people there?
Well, this is a very interesting question. This is a question that's been brought up on the Security Council, even at various hearings in Washington, D.C., at various Senate hearings about most of the countries that have had long civil wars, like Congo, as you mentioned, is where we have most of the minerals that everybody needs in their cell phones and various other things, right? How do we make sure that when we acquire these products, we are not fueling the conflict and therefore actually supporting the killings that are occurring? How do we? Frankly, I'm telling you, I'll be very honest with you, there's no interest in most of the countries who need these products. They are not. Not because the governments are not necessarily interested, because they are private companies that are digging these minerals and they have a pull on the political scene in Washington that they would not allow certain laws to be passed. You understand? So they have strong lobbies and things like that. So what they do is that they will go there, because when you have a war in the country, you can pretty much do anything. You can use cheap labor, you can force people to take things for you, you can take things that you don't have to pay taxes for them. So if the countries are functioning, some of these companies don't want it. And it's not just the United States. You have French companies, you have even Canadian companies, even the Canadians who pride themselves on being the human rights. They are all part of it. So we've tried to have this discussion a lot to try to see how can we all work together, because you can still make profit if the countries are functioning, but you can make maximum profit if they are at war with each other. And this is what it comes down to, really. A few companies that are running things. Even shipping. Let's forget about natural resources, simple shipping. When we were doing the Arms Trade Treaty, we tried to engage Denmark. We tried to engage various other countries in Europe, Germany. And there's a Danish shipping company, I think it's called Maersk or something like that. So you always see it on the containers. And they're responsible for shipping a lot of the arms and ammunition to a lot of these places. So we asked them, can you tell us the companies that give you, because you have a logbook when you ship things, right? What's in the thing? You just take containers. They refuse to give us those documentation, you know, because the people that are giving it, and they say, well, we don't check the goods, we just take them. Seriously? You will know if you have a container of ammunition. If you refuse to take it, people would not destroy each other as much as they would. Sometimes people make the argument, well, even without the weapons, people will still kill each other. Maybe, but not at the rate that they would with the weapons. If you look at Rwanda, for example, people always say, what about Rwanda? What people don't know is this in Rwanda. In Rwanda, most of the weapons that were used for killing were machetes, right? Everybody knows this. Now, most people never think to themselves, how did the machetes get to Rwanda? Everybody always thinks that, oh, it's local machetes. No. If you've been to any African country, you know how a blacksmith makes a machete. It takes a long time to make one. So no African blacksmith are going to make thousands of machetes and start a genocide. Because you get a rod, you put the thing, you blow the fire, and then you beat it, it takes a while. So it was actually bales of machetes were brought from China that were shipped into Rwanda, which were used. So it's all part of the arms trade. This is what we're trying to highlight. So now, when you're taking weapons like that, or when you're taking weapons in Congo, when you know people are getting raped there, people are getting shot down all the time, you really think you're giving it to people to protect themselves? No, you know why you're taking it there, right? So if you don't do anything about it, then what? You know? So that's what we try to do, to put laws in place to hold people accountable who also do some of these things. We used to joke in Sierra Leone, you know, when people, instead of bringing us weapons, if they just brought us rice, we would have just partied. And just say, okay, let's have a cookout or something, you know. But nobody thinks about these sort of things, you know. They bring the weapons, and then they blame people for the usage. Right now, one issue we have, maybe all of you are aware of Libya, right? Of recent, the French and various other Western powers supported people to rise up against Gaddafi. Whatever your stance is on that, that's debatable. But when they gave weapons to these people, nobody had an interest to control the weapons after they finished using them. Now in Libya, they may have a civil war because people were armed. They gave them so many ammunition. There was no interest in taking it back and destroying it. So those ammunitions ended up going to Mali. The war started in Mali and things, you know. So this is what happens when we don't control weapons, you know what I mean? And also because people want the chaos so that they can, you know, get the natural resources for free, pretty much for free, very little money. And that's why Congo continues on and on and on and on. There's no vested interest, really. Yes?
You mentioned this idea of a lost generation of child soldiers with regards to child soldiers living in the States. What is the fate of a child soldier who remains in a country like Sierra Leone, where, say, the UN begins to step back, treaties are signed? What happens to these child soldiers? Are there programs? I know in Sierra Leone there was a lack of these programs. There's maybe like one psychiatrist in the entire country who's trained to deal with child soldiers. So what happens to them? What is it?
Let me rephrase. Actually, the idea of the lost generation applied to everybody. It's not just those in the diaspora. They meant every child soldier. Now, in Sierra Leone, you're absolutely right. The difference, you know, when you get a chance to leave the country, your chances are probably greater to succeed. Because rehabilitation and psychological remaking of a child from war is not only reliant upon the psychiatric care, but it's also the opportunities that you're granted after that. What you do with your life. You know, what family life you have. How stable is that? What opportunities are thrown to you? Frankly, there are programs in place, but they are very short-term focused. They're not long-term. So, and because of that, they're not effective. For example, I work for the organization. I'm very critical. We disagree on this all the time. They're not invested in long-term planning. And donors also are not interested in long-term. If you go to a donor and say, give me money so that I can deal with some issue for 20 years, they won't. If you say for 2 years and I'll give you this result, they will. So you send kids to school for 2 years. What happens after 2 years? You know, nobody's looking for that. And also the opportunities that are provided, there's no market research done in the places to really see what it is that people want. Or nobody asks the people what they want. Programs are designed and forced upon them. For example, you remove a child from a fighting, and you take them back to their village that's completely destroyed still, and then you say to them, oh, you should learn how to sew or be a mechanic. What are you going to do with that? You understand what I'm saying? So it's like, you know, when I was coming from war, it was the same thing. They were saying that, oh, plumbing, mechanic. If this is what you want to do, yes. But also if there's a market for it, yes. You know? But if there's no market for it, so you make people plumber in a place where nobody has running water, what is it going to do? You know? So it's some of these things. So everybody's sitting there looking at it and be like, oh, or you make people mechanics. In their small village where there are 5 cars and then you train 1,000 people to be mechanics. They are all out of a job before they even finish the training, you know? So some of these things, there's no market research done to really see. And some young people are sitting there, nobody's asking them, what do you really want to do? And some of them have ideas. So it's also the belittling of the intelligence of the people on the ground. That's part of it. So we create programs that are not really sustainable as well. We are not working with the government to create infrastructures, rebuild infrastructures that are going to continue doing some of these things. So what we do also, which is another thing, we create the reliance on the non-governmental organizations, on the UN to do the work that the government is supposed to be doing. And therefore the capacity of the government continues to dwindle, you know. So these are all the problems that make it difficult. But yet, you'll be surprised that people still thrive with all of these obstacles. I have a lot of friends who came out of the war, who finished university. Some of them have small businesses. But it just requires somebody to ask questions. One of my friends, after I'd left Sierra Leone, I didn't go back for about 6 years. When I went back, I ran into him. And I asked him, what are you up to? He said, oh yeah, you know, I tried to go to school. I didn't quite finish, but I have this idea and I've been trying to talk to all the NGOs to help me. Nobody wants to. He was an entrepreneur. What he wanted was to start a small business. And this was before internet and cell phones became big, generally in Africa. He said, I want to open an internet cafe. And all he needed was between $800 to $1,000 to do a startup. I gave him that money because I had it. And he paid it to me back. Within 3, 4 months, 6 months, I went back. This kid, he had like 17 computers. He had a soda machine. Now he has one of the biggest, you know, things in it. He's making money. So all you had to do is to hook him up with a business person who could teach him how to manage the money. Now he has a family. He's doing very well. But if he had said that to an angel person, they would be like, no, you're not really serious, because they would belittle his intelligence. So that's what I'm saying. What do we ask people what they want? We're supposed to telling them what we think they need, without even knowing where they are. But yet the market system thrives for the NGOs. For example, if you go to Goma in Congo, you can pull out a US dollar and buy a beer. Because the NGOs that work there, they use that money to buy beer and everything, so they've changed the market. Now Congolese who live there cannot afford to do that. Right? So it works for the NGOs, but not for the people who live on the ground. Anyway. Yes?
So when you go back and you try to talk to like the war, is that what they call, like the people who recruit the soldiers, how do you negotiate with them? Like what, and like how many different places you have to visit?
The question is, how do you negotiate with the warlords when you go? Well, first of all, if we go into a country, we have to make sure we visit all of them, because if you go to one group and you don't go to the rest, you'll be like, oh, you think we're not serious? So you have to please everybody. But what we do is that because each country has signed certain UN resolutions that says they want to remove children from there, because every year the UN puts out a report that shows the countries. It's called a list of shame that shows countries who are recruiting children in government armies and outside. And because of this, you will not sit, in certain meetings at the UN, you'll be excluded for some things because you don't have the right human rights characteristic. So because of this, most people want to clean their record. And also some countries, people are tired of fighting, they want to end it, so they would express that interest. So then we go and sign what is called an action plan with them. This means that they will allow us to go in and identify the young people and remove them before we can begin to do the demobilization program with the adults. You have to show us that you're really interested in it by giving us all the kids. And we start doing this slowly. So that's how we gain access. Now when we go, there are a series of things. Some of these places are very, very remote where we go to. So it also takes a long time to get there. For example, in Central African Republic, where I did, of recent I did work, you take one of these very old Russian planes, small planes that probably will not fly anywhere else but in Africa. And you go, there's a Russian guy who's flying this thing, who's, you know, former Cold War fellow who's probably drunk on vodka like 8 a.m. in the morning. And seriously, I'm saying, you can smell the alcohol on their breath, and then they start flying this thing, you know. And you go, you land in like airfields that are so small. I've been in this many, many times. The plane will come and it will miss the runway, and then you come back around. It's funny to me because I'm like, whatever. And some of my coworkers are kind of sitting there like, oh man, I'm thinking, you can die anywhere in the world. It doesn't have to be necessarily on the plane. I know that fact, you know. So, and then eventually they will land. If it rains, you can't land because it's muddy. And then you land, and you got to get into a car and drive for hours, and with roads that are not barely roads, you know. And so you get to these places, and then of course, everybody's carrying a weapon, and then you have to negotiate with them. First of all, you have to meet them, introduce yourself, get to know them, and then you come back over and over again, you start to create a relationship. And that's how you do it. But it's very difficult. They will never give you everybody at once. They will give you 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, and then it starts as they trust you. And then you have to verify the age of the kids and things like that. So there are lots of processes that go into it. And of course, they try to intimidate you. We don't go with our own bodyguards. We show up just like that. Before, some people wear bulletproof vests and helmets, but if you do that, it shows a distrust. If you go to negotiate with people and you look scared, they're going to use it against you, right? And if you show that you don't trust them, it's not going to work. So I told my team that we have to take off the bulletproof vest and helmets. And some of them were very well, and I'd be like, well, we are already in the warfare, right? If somebody wants to shoot you, they don't need your bulletproof vest. If you take off your helmet and shoot you in the head, that will work. Or they shoot you in the foot and you can't leave, you know. So there are various ways to do it. So, but I had to be very real with my friends to have them understand that we don't need to wear it. Because once you come wearing one, it shows you distrust the person. So therefore, you don't have a good negotiation. So then we sit together and they intimidate certain people and so on, and then we start to know each other, and then that's how we do it. Yes?
How do they choose the kids? They just be like him or him?
No, we walk around. They give us kids, but mostly they're very smart. When they know we're coming, they will hide all the combatants. And only the kids who do the services that are like maybe cook for them, which our kids we also need to remove, they will have them around. So what we do sometimes, once we created a relationship, we'll show up unannounced, and then that's when you see all the kids with the guns. And then we say, okay, we want this kid, because part of the action plan says that if we see a kid and we identify as a kid, then we have to take them. Otherwise, they are default, that means they're not respecting what they want to do. So, and the caveat is because for the disarmament program, they get money for all the adults to stop fighting, give their weapons, and go back home. So the caveat is this: if you don't give us the kids, you're not going to get the money. And so that's usually why. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They actually don't want to do it. You know.
Maybe one more question, and then perhaps you'll come up front here, because a lot of people have to go. Maybe one last question, please.
Okay, it's a tough one. Should I choose? Okay.
Do you feel bad about what you did as a child soldier, or do you feel like you did what you need to do to stay alive?
If I feel bad about what I did as a child soldier, I don't feel bad about it. I wish I hadn't done it, and I wish nobody else to do it. But at the time, it was the only way to live, you know, to survive and to gain access to the limited resources that were available. It's not an excuse, but it's the reality of war. Because I think oftentimes we don't know about war, or we don't know about violence as much, so we can easily just decide before we're engaged in it, before our life is threatened, that we know how we would react. Nobody knows what you would do if you find yourself in the position that many children find themselves in. As you can imagine, most of these children were like you in their countries before the war came about. They're just regular kids going to school, you know, playing football, doing things, whatever kids do, you know. And then they found themselves. I found myself in war and capable of things that I never thought I was. So all of us have that capacity to lose our humanity completely in these things. But it becomes a necessity. It becomes a way to survive as well. And for a while, you actually don't know how to do anything but to survive. When I came to the United States, it's one of the things that my mother, who adopted me, told me that made a difference in my life, I would say, which I try to tell to a lot of the young people I meet, which is that to survive war requires a remarkable intelligence. So all the kids that are surviving this war are very intelligent, because it's, you know, and very strong will. But you don't know how to think long term. You only know how to think short term. So you know how to live for the next minute, The most tormenting question when I came here was when somebody asked, what are you going to do in 4 years? I was like, I just got here. What about, would you wait till tomorrow and see whether I'm still alive? So I used to think. And when I was in high school, actually, I used this to my advantage. Since I'm very aware, my math teacher, very, very bad at math. I tried very hard, but I could never get anywhere with it. I realized that in my class, you get 60% for doing your homework. But the teacher was not paying attention to the homework. She would just look to see if you did it. So the first day, I did my homework very neatly, and then the next day, I would just copy the same homework over and over again. Because I observed the teacher very well, and I knew, nobody else could figure it out. I knew that this was what's going on. And of course, I was on my way to getting the 60%, you know, I was working very beautifully. But because I knew how to survive, because I was thinking to myself, I don't need the math, I might not even live to see tomorrow, why do I need to study all this stuff, right? So my mom caught up on it and said to me, you have to use your intelligence to live, not to survive. It's one of the most striking things that anybody had said to me after the war, and that changed my life. tremendously, because prior to that, I knew how to get by every day. I was very good at it. And so I had to change that, you know. So in a way also, that's the experience that you get from it. What should I say lastly? Well, I think that's about it. Well, thank you.